We're now ready to tackle evaluating different powers of I. And to do this, we're going to fill out the table that you see below here and see if we might just notice any kind of pattern that will help us in this task. So let's begin on the left, and we know that I to the first simply equal to I. And we know that I squared from earlier in this module is equal to -1. Now for I to the third, we could think of that as being the product of I to the first and I squared. And so this would be I then times -1, or I cubed would be equal to -I. Now moving on to I to the fourth, we could think of this as being the product of I squared and I squared, which would be equal to -1 times -1, or I to the fourth then will be equal to +1. Now moving to the next column, I to the fifth, we can again rely on previous powers of I to help us out here. We could think of this as being the product of I squared and I to the third, and I squared we know to be -1, and I to the third we know to be -I. So the product then would turn out to be +I, or I to the first. Now what can we do for I to the sixth? Well, there are different ways we could break this down, but I think what I'm going to do is break it down into the product of I squared and I to the fourth, and I squared we know to be -1. I to the fourth is +1, so this product turns out to be -1. Now what about I to the seventh? Well, let's think about that as being the product of I to the fourth and I to the third. I to the fourth, we know from the first column, is 1. I to the third is -I. And so the product turns out to be then just -I. Are you beginning to see a pattern emerging here? Let's continue on. I to the eighth we can think of as I to the fourth times I to the fourth. That would be then 1 times 1, or +1. Now let's stop for a moment and see if we do notice any kind of a pattern here. If we look at I to the first, which is I, you can see that's the same thing as I to the fifth, which is also I. I squared is -1, and I to the sixth is -1. I to the third is -I, and I to the seventh is -I. I to the fourth is +1, and I to the eighth is +1. So you can see that the four values in the first column are repeated in the second column. Now let's see if that pattern holds for the third column. So if we evaluate I to the ninth, we could think of that as being the product of, well, let's see here. Why don't we try I to the eighth times I to the first. And I to the eighth, we see from the bottom of the second column is equal to 1, then times I, and the result then is I. I to the 10th, we could think of as being I to the sixth times I to the fourth. I to the sixth we know is -1. I to the fourth we know is +1, so the result turns out to be then -1. And for I to the 11th, how should we break that down? Well, let's say we break it down into I to the 9th times I squared. And I to the 9th, from the first entry in this column, is I. I squared we know is negative 1. So this product turns out to be then negative I. And finally, moving on to I to the 12th. Why don't we split that up into the product of I to the 6th and I to the 6th, which we know from the second column the value of each of those is negative 1, so then the product turns out to be positive 1. So now does the pattern continue to hold? Well, let's look. I to the 9th did turn out to be I, which was the same as I to the 5th and I to the 1st. I to the 10th turned out to be negative 1, so that value holds for the second entry in that column. I to the 11th turns out to be negative I, consistent with the other values in that row, which is I to the 3rd and I to the 7th. And finally, I to the 12th turns out to be positive 1, which is the same as I to the 8th and I to the 4th. Now, it should seem reasonable then that any power of I that we may want to evaluate will match one of the values that we see in the first column, which would be either I, negative 1, negative I, or positive 1. Now, let's suppose you want to evaluate a very large power of I. You know it will match up with one of the four values you see in column 1. And the question is, which one? The key to this puzzle will be found if you read further along in this module.